All right, class, picking up where we left off. This is literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, part three. Okay, almost done with it. Now, as I was saying, I had said, Charles II's reign was so different from the Commonwealth, right? It was extravagant, luxurious, indulgent, and very Catholic. Now, actually, Char- Charles II wasn't a Catholic when he ascended the throne, but people always worried he really was because he did things kind of like in a very Catholic way. He was very much an autocratic ruler and believed in the divine right of kings. However, at one point he promised to become Catholic, but he did not actually convert to Catholicism till on his deathbed. So on his deathbed, he did actually convert. So people kind of felt like, oh, you finally went through with it, right? Anyway, just wanted to clear that up in case there was any sort of misunderstanding there. Um, so, James II, though, after Charles II died, his brother James II was Catholic. All right, he ascended the throne of England, um, and he maybe tried to play the game. I'm not really Catholic, but he was definitely training up his son in Catholicism and had him baptized. Okay, so the people were like, we're going to go back to Catholicism again as the main religion in England if we don't do something now and nip this problem in the bud, because the heir to the throne was just baptized Catholic. All right. And James II seems really Catholic. So they instituted the Glorious Revolution of 1688 because they soon tired of the Catholic leaning and autocratic leaning of James II's reign. And instead of beheading James II, as the Puritans had beheaded Charles I, instead of beheading James II, instead they forced him to relinquish his throne, kind of like, hey, you want to be beheaded again? Like your brother's dad or your uncle? Well, if not, then you better relinquish the throne. So he did. He relinquished the throne for fear that he would suffer the same fate as Charles the First. Um, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, Charles the First was his father, not his uncle. What was I saying? No, because of course Charles the Second and James the Second were brothers. So I correct myself there. So hopefully you were watching until this point so you can hear that correction. Yeah. Charles the First was the father of James the Second and Charles the Second because those guys were brothers, right? So he didn't want to suffer the same fate as his father, Charles the First. Charles II's Anglican daughter, Mary II, and her husband William III of Orange ascended the throne. So Charles II, they ascended the throne and reigned as co-monarchs because William was also James II's nephew. So actually, they could both be the monarchs. So that's interesting, right? Because there had not been in modern English history like co-monarchs. There had been like queens of England when there were kings, but the queens weren't considered co-monarchs. No, they weren't. The king was the ultimate, and the queen just happened to be his wife, right? As a title given to the wife of the king. Now, Queen Elizabeth was queen, and she was the sole monarch, but she wasn't married either. So William and Mary, they were actually married, and they served as co-monarchs. Um, and and that was called the Glorious Revolution because there wasn't a lot of bloodshed. Um, yeah. So her father, yes, her father was actually James II and Charles II's niece. And Charles II had, I believe, appointed her, to be a potential heir. So anyway, no, she was the daughter, I'm sorry, I'm checking this. She was the daughter of James, Duke of York. I want to get this right. A minute, I'm going to look this up right now. So Mary II was a Protestant. She became queen after the Glorious Revolution. Yes, and her father was James II. She is James II's daughter, as I said, and Charles II's niece. Um, but she was decidedly Protestant, unlike her father, James II. Um, and unlike his male heir, who was baptized Catholic. So anyway, people were happy with that. Okay, it seemed like a good solution to preserve the monarchy along the proper lines, because they were very much into this line of inheritance, right? Um, and yet, they now did not have this Catholic leading monarch. So Mary II and her husband William III of Orange ascended the throne and reigned as co-monarchs. Mary II's sister Anne, her sister Anne, succeeded William and Mary, and she became Queen of England. So they had another queen. So all these queens all of a sudden, it's kind of interesting, right? Like, what does that say for women's rights? That all of a sudden you can have this divine ruler, the divinely appointed ruler of the entire country, and it's a woman. And yet women had no rights under the law for the most part. They couldn't really inherit property. They couldn't be educated at the schools. They couldn't really have jobs out in the communities. There were very, very few, like seamstress or nanny or governess. Kind of like the same things they would be doing at home, taking care of their home. They could do those for other people and get paid for them. But that's about it. You're not going to have a woman be a lawyer or a doctor, right? So anyway, Anne died with no surviving children. It was very sad for her. So even though she had a lot of children, but I think they all died, and yeah, very sad. Anyway, her second cousin, grandson of James I's daughter, Elizabeth, his name was George I, of the Hanover family, became King of England. Now, the Hanover family was from Germany. So, all of a sudden, we have George I, George II, and George III, who all spoke German, being the kings of England. Very interesting, huh? Kind of like when William I became King of England. Way back when, I told you, after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and it brought all these French language speakers into the government, and they spoke French as the language of the government in England for about 300 to 400 years. Maybe not quite 400 years. No, that's a little too long. For about 300 years, maybe, or so, a little more than that. And so that's how we got all those Latinate words into English, with that French, because they're Latin based. Anyway, here now all of a sudden we have Germans ruling England. Hanover, yeah, the House of Hanover. These kings of German descent were extremely unpopular in England. You could imagine, right? All of a sudden, their kings speak German, and they're from another country. You're like, what? Why are you ruling us? You don't know anything about us. You're German, right? Even though you're descended from our royal family, like they were all kind of like cousins and things like that across Europe, because they would like marry each other off to the families to broker relations between the countries. So anyway, they were extremely unpopular, and this lack of popularity and bad decision making on the part of the kings in their treatment of the British colonies in America led to the colonies declaring their independence from and going to war against England. Remember, that's the Revolutionary War, or the American Revolution. They revolted against George III specifically, who was, pretty much a German-speaking king. He was very much, we control you. And we said, nope, we want taxation with representation, not without. They didn't allow those colonists to make decisions or vote on things. And so we very much said, you know what? How do you know anything about how to decide things over here in the colonies? You don't live here. We don't have representation in your government. And so you have no idea how to make rules for what works here in these colonies that are on a completely different continent. Well, yeah. So they declared their independence from England. And then, of course, we had the Revolutionary War, which culminated in England's loss of the colonies and the establishment of a new English-speaking nation, the United States of America, where we all now reside, right? Or at least most of us in this class. During all this religious and political upheaval, the middle class continued to rise. Urbanization and mercantilism contributed to the influx of wealth that propelled the middle class. We have this growing middle class now. Puritan values fostered the spread of education and doctrines of equality because there was so much emphasis on, we need to have our own personal relationship with God. And that put everybody more on the same footing, right? And it also spread education. Growing mercantilism and the printing press made solid business out of selling magazines and novels and pamphlets to the masses, and increased education and equality overflowed even to the lives of women. And a greater need for writings led to a greater need for writers. So roles into which some women were able to step, because all of a sudden they need many more things written because we have this growing middle class that's becoming more educated, that's being able to read, and they want stuff to read. So people need to write it. And without enough writers, they started, okay, if women are writing, well, maybe some of you guys can get published because we have a lot of people who want to read. So that's how you saw this shift in women finally being able to make it as writers. Some of them, very, very few, but still, it's finally trickling into the economy here. So, technology, however, forced women more and more out of the home-based professions. So remember, I told you they could pretty much do professions that were kind of like what they did at home, right? So they could brew alcohol, they could farm, they could sew, they could be governesses, tutors, wasn't not really a tutor, but like a governess. When so you take care of the children, you teach them good manners and things like that. So therefore, women had more time and money on their hands because of the spread of wealth and literacy to the middle classes. So the middle classes were growing in wealth, and so women had a little bit more leisure time too, because they could maybe hire people to do things that they used to, or maybe inventions could help them do some of what they did before. And sure, people were being farmers, so that led to, like, farming is really labor intensive job. So that freed up some women's time if they weren't, running a farm, with their husband. Therefore, women had more time and money because of the spread of wealth and literacy. So women of leisure, now a status symbol that often extended from the aristocracy now into the middle class somewhat. They became readers too, and they had money to buy books. So women readers gave women writers more legitimacy. Though societal conventions still predominantly frowned on women writing, as evidenced by women continuing to write mainly in the form of letters and diaries, and as anonymous authors in many cases actually, and at other times as self-effacers, right? Like they would be like, oh, I'm writing, but I'm just a lowly woman. Don't give me too much precedence. And I'm only writing in my spare time. I'm not neglecting my duties as a mother or a wife. I just had a little bit of downtime, so I wrote a little bit right now. All right. I didn't take anything away from my other God ordained duties. So that's how women would tend to write during this time period. Bold feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft existed, but they were still intimidated by social and even puritanical religious mores, all right? Because they still, even though they had returned to that Church of England, there still was that Puritan influence. It still was strong. There are a lot of people who were like, I like some of that, and so that said, we need to make sure women, they can be educated and they can read and have that personal relationship with the Bible and all that, but they need to be wives and mothers, right? And serve their husbands. Anyway, they extol equality on one hand, the Puritans, but they still located women squarely within the non-material sphere of domesticity. That means the house, the home, the family. So you see this kind of push and pull, right, between education and traditional roles going on in the lives of these women, which we will get into next. So that is the end of our introduction to this time period, the 17th and 18th centuries, or the 1600s and the 1700s. All right, enjoy these women writers. They're so great. All right, thanks for listening, guys. See you when we talk about the women, the writers, their lives, and their writings.